As it turns out, when Iyengar did his study, what he found was that when people see episodic frames, so let's talk about the one on poverty, they blame the individual in the report for their situation.
They blame Joe?
They blame Joe. They blame Joe. Well said. When they see a report about poverty, they tend to go ahead and say, that dude ought to get his shit together, basically. They probably use less coarse language, but that's me. This person ought to get their act together. Maybe go back to school, get a degree, go move in with somebody. Don't they have a relative somewhere? They tend to blame the individual for their situation, and the solution to this guy's problems should come from the individual. In other words, you were saying that the reason that you would like an episodic frame is because it would draw people in, and it does draw people in, but it doesn't motivate them to want to go ahead and change things. Instead, what they typically wind up doing is saying, that guy ought to get his act together. Episodic frames draw people in. If you're trying to make money, episodic frames are good because you'll pull people in. But if what you're trying to do as a journalist is change the world in some way, not so much. I remember I saw a news report about homelessness in San Luis Obispo. And I still remember, I saw this report 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago. And they did an episodic frame. It was about this woman, her name was Barbara. And in this case, Barbara was a homeless person. In San Luis Obispo, what they'd done is they'd set up this parking lot where what happened was a lot of women living in their cars on the streets, and it was dangerous. And so they would pull into this parking lot, and they would lock this gate behind them, and it had like wires over the top so that they would be protected at night, and then they would open it up in the morning and let them back out. And so they were interviewing Barbara, and Barbara she just looked like your average 55, 56-year-old woman, but she was living in her car with her 2 huge dogs. She carried her china with her when she lost her house. She kept her china with her, which I thought was weird, but apparently some people think is normal. Like, yeah, Phil, you got to keep your china. I just don't get that, so I remembered that. But again, for me, the whole time I was watching it, and it wasn't like I was unsympathetic to Barbara's situation. She seemed like a nice enough person, but I just kept thinking to myself, what's her deal? Is there a mental health issue? Is she a drug user? I was just wondering. This is how people respond. When people see thematic frames, they tend to blame society or the government. They tend to think that society or the government should do something about it. The solution should come from society or the government. So if you go ahead and you see a story about poverty, and it's a thematic frame, maybe you don't think, did you guys not get this? They blame society or the government, and they think that the solution should come from society or the government. So if you do a report on homelessness and it's a thematic frame, then what people will be doing is saying either, man, the government should do something about this. This is terrible the way this is done. Or maybe they'll say, our church should do something. Or maybe we should get our mosque to do something, or our synagogue to do something. They'll think that society is responsible.
So the impact of the issue would be motivate them to do something?
Yes, so the impact on the issue here is very small.
It would be.
Because people don't, it has a very small impact. You get a big audience, but you have a small impact. Down here, the impact on the issue is larger, but what do you have? You have a smaller audience. Why do you have a smaller audience?
Because they're not interested. They didn't attract as many when they put up one picture.
Exactly. When they go and they start having experts on, and it's kind of boring, and they're going to show
one-on-one.
Pardon me?
It wasn't like a one-on-one.
Yeah, when all of a sudden you're hearing a report about some person who's homeless, and you're like, oh my God, that's so sad. And you're watching it, they say, okay, now we're going to have an interview from a professor from UCLA from the School of Public Policy. It's like, okay, I'm already asleep. Right, exactly. I'm already bored. Right, let me show you a graph. Right? It's like, oh. So people, the impact on the issue will be larger among your audience, but your audience is going to be much smaller. So it's exactly sort of the opposite of what all of our instincts would be. Do an episodic frame. Draw these people in. Get them emotionally connected. Well, it turns out that if you get them emotionally connected, what happens is they go ahead and they decide that the individual is the problem here.
So you're saying that the media is compelled to do things that are moist to the public but less impactful for each other?
That when they use episodic frames, and they use episodic frames, I would argue, because they attract a bigger audience, they have less of an impact on the issues that they're trying to address. Now, they always have the choice, and the reality is, just to be clear, is that on most news reports, what really happens is, if it's episodic is over here and thematic is over here, most news reports kind of go back and forth between the two. They'll do a little bit of episodic, maybe add a dash of thematic in here, do a little episodic, put a little thematic. So he was just looking at when people see purely episodic and purely thematic frames. But what's interesting is that what he showed was exactly the opposite of what our intuition would be. Now, having said that, let me just go ahead and say one last thing. This wasn't true for every issue. Like, because people are not idiots. So if they go ahead and they do a report, and they want to do a report on a soldier who lost his arms and his legs in Iraq because a hand grenade was thrown into his vehicle and he dove on it to protect his 5 buddies, and so they tell a report on him, that people aren't going to go like, dude shouldn't have jumped on the hand grenade. We're not crazy, right? But when it comes to issues of crime, drug use, poverty, things like that, this plays out almost exactly the opposite of what our intuition would tell us. Okay? Now, I want to go back to the hypodermic needle theory for a second. This idea that people are easily manipulated by the media. And I'm going to, as much as I can, present to you guys the argument again and again and again that the hypodermic needle theory is not true. People are not that influenced by the media. We tend to forget about how many defenses we have and how we are able to protect ourselves from change. So, I want to go back to the RAS model. Remember what we talked about, the R and RAS. What does that stand for? Receive. Receive and understand, right? In order for anything to affect you, you have to receive it and you have to understand it. Well, there's something called selective exposure. And this is what we were talking about before. Selective exposure is the idea that people decide what media they're going to expose themselves to. Nobody sits us in a chair, puts our arms down, sticks toothpicks in our eyes, and forces us to watch something we don't want to watch. We decide what we're going to watch. And so what do people watch? Things that confirm what they already believe. One of the ways that we protect ourselves from having our attitudes and our opinions changed is we make sure that we go to places that are going to tell us things that we already agree with. Selective exposure. We decide what we're going to watch. We decide what we're going to be exposed to. And that gives us a tremendous amount of control because we can effectively prevent ourselves from coming into contact with things we disagree with. The A in the RAS model. What's the A? Right, accept and reject. That when we do encounter information that challenges what we believe, we counter-argue. We argue against it. If you're somebody who believes that taxes on wealthy people should be high, and somebody gives you an argument that they should be low, you're going to counter-argue. Well, what about this and what about that? They're already paying a bunch. Why are you penalizing them for being successful? Boom. You're going to jump right into it. We have the ability to counter-argue. We decide what we're going to be exposed to, and when we do encounter information that we disagree with,